It looks like it's about that time. I gotta try to start on time because I do have a tendency to wax poetic or wander off into side topics if somebody asks a question, which is why I have slides to try to keep me on track. I don't know if anybody in here has been to, I'm sure a lot of you have been to LinuxFest before. Is anybody, is this your first LinuxFest? Yes, more people at LinuxFest. Okay, so has anybody heard me talk previously? Okay, I promise I tried to mix it up a little bit this year. So this is similar to talks I've given previously. This might be the year I retire this one, actually. I'm thinking of submitting a different one. It's a similar topic, but would be different in delivery, so that it is a little more interactive and exciting than just me talking at you for a half an hour. I like getting people involved. Like last year, I had people delete the web server after I attacked it. I don't have a demo this year at the end. Normally, I talk for quite a while, and then for the last 5 minutes, I pull up a website that I set up, that I control, and I attack it, and then I invite someone to come delete the entire contents of the server. Which is fun. But for your guys' information, I was sick earlier this week and spent all my energy to get well so I could come and talk today. So I don't have 103-degree fever today. That's the only reason why I didn't bring my boat anchor. I didn't feel like I was quite up to lugging the 15 pounds of laptop and power supply. Here, my laptop's 12 pounds. So I look forward to, if I submit next year, which I most likely will, it'll be web server security as a topic, but it will be interactive and hopefully interesting, and you'll get something out of it. Hopefully you get something out of today, though. So needless to say, if you're here for LinuxFest 2016 Web Server Security Evaluating Risks, you're in the right room. Or I'm in the wrong room. You know, something could be happening. So we'll get started. While yes, there is no demo, I do have a tendency to talk about things that could be considered questionable. I do believe that when you want to learn to defend your system, you have to learn how people get in your system, right? So my intention today is not to show you how to hack or how to teach you how to hack, right? But I am here to show you how easy it is, or explain how easy it is for someone with malicious intent to get into your web server if it's not properly secured. It is very easy to make a mistake. The vast majority of attacks, unintentional attacks I would say in a way on the internet, have to do with misconfigured servers. And it's not too hard to make a tiny issue. My demo I have, one route of potential attack, is one typo when setting up phpMyAdmin made it so that you could access it externally. One tiny typo, not a very big one. One that if you're in a hurry, you might not have noticed you made. Also, when I talk about vulnerability assessment and pen testing, do know, never practice it on an open network. If it doesn't belong to you, that's a crime, right? If it belongs to you, still be careful how you do it. If your work asks you to do a vulnerability assessment, get written permission, right? You want to have, if you get brought in to do a vulnerability assessment, you need to have insurance, and you need to have written permission. Make sure you always have that. I've heard some pretty fun stories. So I'm going to talk about what you need as a baseline when we're talking about web server security, and keep in mind this is an intermediate talk. Okay? I have a tendency to just dive right into talking and not introduce myself. So I'm going to stop for a second, take a breath. I'm Christy Saunders. So that's why it's C Saunders on there. I didn't get around to adding my profile because, things have been crazy. I'm currently an adjunct professor at Whatcom Community College, where I teach network security and networking. I'm also in the last part of, I'm getting a new degree, so I'm completing the end of my Master's of Information Assurance. So there's that. I enjoy competing in competitions. So way back when, I participated in the Pacific Regional Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition. I've competed in the National Cyber League, and things like that. Because those are fun. If you haven't competed, don't be afraid. Find something like that. Participate. A National Cyber League is an individual competition. And right now they have their spring, if you're a student, right now they have their spring competition just starting. So you can still sign up for it. I'm a coach this year. Alright, so back on topic. Defense in depth. So what I mean by defense in depth, I do not mean guarding your web server with a barbarian horde, right? Or with 20 of the exact same firewall. When you talk about defense in depth, it's more like an onion, right? You want to do your security in layers. And it's not just one thing. It is easy to look at your web server and think of it as one thing, right? Your web server is your web server. But it's not. It is a layer of different applications that are operating on hardware, which exists in a location, right? Is your web server on a virtualized computer? Is it on a dedicated server? So you want to look at how you're going to protect those items. So for example, is anybody familiar with the onion approach to web server security? Or to security at all? So it would look like the inner portion of your, I'll go to the next one. You want to protect your data security. So that might look like having ACLs, like file ACLs. You want to do your host security, so is that firewalls on your host? How you control your users, how do they access that, when can they access that? What's the physical security? Can anybody just walk up to your web server and push the power button? If so, you might want to revisit that, right? And then outside of all that, you have your policies and procedures. And you can break this down even further. You could have your what devices. If you had the same firewall throughout your network, so in your own network, separate from your firewall, if it's the same firewall, if somebody can circumvent that first firewall, they have a strategy to circumvent all your firewalls. So you want to vary that up. So you want to have defense in depth, so that's how deep, right? And you want to layer it. And you want to have variety. So when you're talking about defense in depth versus security and obscurity, so, follow the yellow brick road. A lot of times people are like, well, but why would somebody want to attack my website? I'm just some little guy. I'm not Boeing, right? Well, that is relying on someone not finding you. And that's not the best security, right? If you're like, well, the house next to mine looks nicer, so I'm not going to worry about locking my front door. Are you guys going to do that?
No.
Right. Because someone still might try your door, right? Also, what if your house is actually really close to your neighbor? So someone might use your house to get to your neighbor's house, right? It's the same way with your website. You may not be the intended eventual target. So when looking and examining who might be attacking you, that's where we get into evaluating risks. The person attacking your website might be some guy who just wants to deface it, right? But you have a hobby mini collection painting site, and where people who like to collect minis go and talk about it, right? You wouldn't think somebody necessarily is going to attack your website, right? You're a hobby site. You don't sell anything. You don't have any sort of value, you think, right? Except one of those people who's collecting stuff on your site is the CEO of a company, and someone else is actually a system administrator for, say, Boeing. But you don't know that, do you? But maybe the person who's been watching that worker at Boeing does. So they're going to attack your website and harvest it for information, because the number one issue that we have with our users is what? Password reuse. So they get that user login and password, and now they're going to go back to those companies' websites and use the passwords that that user used. It lets them set up a whole new password database. So you don't want to just rely on obscurity because you think that since I'm not a big deal. I'm not Tesla, I'm not Boeing, so someone's not going to want to target me. It doesn't mean that they don't want to use you for a watering hole. And I will talk about watering holes in a bit, which is a specific type of attack. So that's even beyond what I just talked about, where it's going after you to get one user's information. So when we have obscurity, we're relying on someone not being interested in us or not being able to find us because we're not a big deal. You know, we're a paper company in Bellingham who supplies stationery. Why is somebody like the Syrian Liberation Army going to attack my website? So I'm not going to worry about security because I'm not going to worry about anybody else that might attack my website. So when you want to take stock of your web server, right? You want to look at what is in the network. So hopefully your web server, if you're in charge of it, it's probably in a DMZ, right? So the demilitarized zone. Hopefully you have it segregated from the rest of your network. I will tell you this, if you scan that network and you find your business stuff in there, you may not have segregated your network appropriately, right? And that has happened, where your DMZ and your business network overlap because there was a small mistake when your network was being set up. So you'll want to take an inventory of your network. Also, maybe you're the new IT guy and you don't know that 7 years ago they put a server back there, right? And when you run that scan, you find some unknown server. Now, if you had not run that scan, you wouldn't have known that server was in your DMZ. And a good example of that would be, I have actually heard of where people did a scan of their network and they found an unknown device. And they started trying to hunt it down. And they could never find it. They gave up on it and they eventually blacklisted it with their firewalls and stuff. But they did not find it. So it's good to know where it is. I actually, another one is an older server that was in a back room that was behind a brick wall. I don't know why the wall got bricked over or why there was still a server connected to power back there, but it was on their network and they didn't know until they took an assessment of their network, right? So Nmap, for those who don't know, is a GUI for, that one's command line. There is a GUI called ZenMap if you are not familiar with using Nmap. And the nice thing about using ZenMap, if you're not familiar with using Nmap, is it does give you the commands for Nmap in it. So you can start getting used to that. Once again, I'm going to say, don't run this on an open network, okay? You never want to rely on the charity of the judge, right? Because when it comes to using tools, and one thing I'm going to let you guys know right now, is the person who gets to decide your intention is not you, right? So in other items you may own, you get to decide how you intend to use it, right? And if you told people I intended this for a particular purpose, they would believe you. When it comes to these types of tools, you don't get to decide it's law enforcement and whatever company you may have accidentally touched. So you want to find out what devices are on your network, and you need to get a baseline. You need to understand how your web server is running, what is on it, right? Who can connect to it, when they're going to connect to it. So what is normal behavior on that server? Because even if it's a new malware and you have software on there to detect malware and it is so new that that doesn't have that signature yet, by detecting abnormal behavior, you may be able to discover it before it gets loose. You can use this to find any hidden computer devices on your network. So what if you have a disgruntled person who has plugged in a physical device to your web server so that they can have remote access? So what do you need to secure? Yeah, definitely it's PHP-MyAdmin, right?
Number one scan for application on the internet.
What?
It's the number one scan for application in my logs.
Well, if I was going to go and maliciously check out if somebody had that accessible, what would I do?
Compromise the server.
Well, not even compromise the server. There's a small typo you can put, and the person can actually put in the web server's name and / PHP-MyAdmin. That's all they need to do. I gave this demo to some politicians, and I was like, now do this. Now just add PHP-MyAdmin. And they were like, okay. And I go, now you're in the backside of my website. And they were like, this doesn't feel like hacking. I was like, I know, but you just did, because you're on the backside of my website. If I hadn't given you permission, then you were now in the back of you were in my house without my permission. What can they do once they're in your PHP-MyAdmin? Yeah, they could download your users. If you, as a side note, has anybody in here used shopping CMSs like Zencart? Okay, I love Zencart. Okay, I don't want to beat it up too much. I do actually love it. The demo I give, I actually attack my Zencart website because I make it insecure by following just very basic setup. I don't actually do anything incorrect. I follow basic setups and I don't go any further, right? And it's an older Zencart. There's the danger, right? It's not updated. There's a whole list of things. If you go to Google, you can find a walkthrough of how to compromise your Zencart. So you can test your Zencart to see if you're not updated appropriately. Now, if your PHP-MyAdmin has one typo, you can get in the back end. If you set up your Zencart slightly wrong, it will store credit cards in the clear. Does anybody feel like weird about that? I hope so. So, for those of you who may not know when it's stored in the clear, it's in clear text. It can be read plain as day. Somebody can go download it, and they have all the credit cards right there. You want to secure your Apache, right? If your Apache has administrative access to your server, and someone compromises your Apache, that means they have administrative access to your server. There are ways around that, right? If you're running Linux, which is I'm taking this from a Linux perspective, so I'm not talking about WAMP servers or XAMPP servers. I'm talking about LAMP. You can use something like, for example, SE Linux, right? Security Enhanced Linux, because then it will confine Apache to that which Apache has permission. SQL. Everybody here installed SQL before? So if you just run through the secure, they have a little command for that, running through the secure, when you want to secure it, it drops all your test users. You get all the way to the end, secure MyAdmin, secure SQL. When you get to the very end, it says, congratulations, your SQL is now secure. That is not true. Okay, it's just more secure than it was 5 minutes ago. So what that walks you through is it gets you to change your admin password, and it drops all the test users. But there are more things that you need to do to secure your SQL, right? So what kind of things, does anybody here secure their SQL? I want to have a discussion on that. Okay, what have you done?
I secure my SQL.
Mm-hmm.
Running it on a non-standard port, so 3306 is the default. Changing that to a different port, not allowing remote access to it, stuff like that.
Okay.
If you got a web front end to your SQL backend, it's really important to mitigate SQL injection and access vulnerabilities to like input standardization of streams and stuff.
Right. So that's a big one, right? You want to have watch for injection attacks, and so I was going to talk about that a little bit, and that's what I wanted. I really wanted to hear that. Yeah.
Not listening on a port if it's just serving local applications.
Mm-hmm. So it shouldn't be taking stuff if it's just giving, right?
On my MySQL server, the only user that has permission to drop anything is root, so that prevents anyone from getting access to a low-level user being able to drop records.
Right. So that's when you get back into the whole idea of your basic security, right? So should your root be able to remote in?
No.
Correct.
And also, like as a form of like data protection, you want to make sure they're using like strong encryption algorithms and salting for all the data
Right.
Just to, because it's really difficult to always keep advanced at like 0 days and things like that. So you can do some form of mitigation by encrypting your data.
Right. So you take a look at the kind of information you're storing in your database, and if it's information that you don't want out, right? If somebody managed to get in, so you want to assume that that could happen. So you want to protect that and encrypt that data. Remember, when you're setting up your LAMP server, every application you add introduces potential vulnerabilities to your server, right? Because it adds additional complexity. And then, of course, 0-day attacks. So vulnerabilities that you don't know are there yet, right? How many times have we seen an announcement when it comes to Windows where it says, affects everything back through Windows 95? Well, that's like pretty much everybody, right? So I'm talking about your intrusion detection system, your IPS system, and your firewall. So you're going to use most likely either an IDS or an IPS in your in your DMZ. There are advantages to both. The downside, of course, using an intrusion detection system over there is you can't. It's just going to alert, right? It's not going to turn anything off. With your IPS, the downside, of course, is that false positives can happen, which means it's going to block legitimate traffic. Now, you never know what can trigger that. I mean, you got to go back through your firewalls and see what triggered it, if it was legitimate traffic. A good example is I was administrating a website, and I had one user out of everybody could not access the website for the life of him. And I knew him. He was the type of person who he could go to a website and use it. That was pretty much his skill level. So I contacted, they were using shared hosting. I contacted their tech support because I had control of most of how the server was set up. And I was like, hey, what's going on? Because the IPS has blocked this guy. And they contacted me like, okay, he's unblocked, but tell him not to do that again. That wasn't very helpful. I contacted him and I was like, okay, they said you can use the website again, can you? He's like, yeah. I go, okay, they said don't do that again. He goes, what was I doing? I just went to the website. So I was like, okay, well, I'm thinking the next thing you probably need to do then is check out your computer and make sure it doesn't have any malware and that you're not compromised because perhaps someone is using your website, your computer, to attack the website. Now, are you using IP tables? You know, when you're using your Linux, there's more advanced firewalls. There's way more advanced than that now. You can choose, right? This dates back to when I first started doing that. When I first did this, one example I gave everybody was with IP tables. What is your Linux version you're using, right? So check your host firewall. Are you using the software? Is it up to date? Can you configure it the way you want it to? Are you using a hardware firewall? You know, once again, can you configure it the way you want it to? Very important. Least privilege, right? So you have security enhanced Linux as an option. That enforces your concept of least privilege. It uses MAC, which is mandatory access control, and that can reduce potential damage. I mean, if someone even gets access or they compromise your Apache and get in the system, the person who's compromised it is still limited to what Apache can do. It makes the I would say, invasion of your server go slower because they must now move, they can't just move laterally easy because they are confined to what they compromised. So if they compromise a particular piece of software that doesn't have permission to create new users, for example, they can't create a new user for themselves. Now, on the other hand, they get one of your junior sysadmins used an easy password because she didn't enforce password complexity rules, and he chose the password 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And as much as we all may laugh at that, when you guys go home, go check the top 100 used password. There's a group that analyzes top used passwords in security breaches, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 is in the top 10. Password is still in the top 10 as well. So is admin. So make sure your users only have access to the level which they should have access. Watch out for privilege creep. You know, that's where people keep getting more privileges. Maybe they get added to something they shouldn't have. So you should audit your users' access periodically. Check your software. Is there software that has more permission than it should have? Do you have a particular software that for some reason has root privilege? If so, that's a huge danger to your web server. This is where vulnerability assessments come in pretty handy, right? I couldn't really go through this all that stopping to talk about the APT. So advanced persistent threat, also known as a motivated attacker. Now this is a type of attacker that is more sophisticated than the average ones we were talking about, okay? They don't want to just get in and leave. Normally an APT's goal is to get in and maintain access. Okay? So this isn't somebody who wants to just get in and wreck your server. They don't want to just get in and deface your website, although they might, because there is an APT, the Syrian electronic army. They're known for defacing websites. It's what they do. They are mission oriented, so their job when they get into your website is to deface it and change your website, and then they get out. If you have a different kind of APT, they're here to steal your intellectual data or your user data or the credit cards. They might not just wanting to do a one-time dump and run, think Target, right? They might want to do something more like get into your system and steal all the credit card data of all your users or all their personal information, but then be able to come back in 6 months and do it again. So that's where you get into the idea of when you hear about a breach and they're like, they've been in our system for 8 months, right? Well, that's because that's what they were doing. They were in there getting data over and over again. So the one way to watch for that is you want to watch for exfiltration of data. So there's software you can use to watch for data leaving your system. And that's where getting a baseline comes in handy. If you already have your baseline, that unusual activity is going to get picked up, right? And the thing with APTs, this plays into this. They have more money behind them normally. So we're talking hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to develop weaponized malware. So they have a higher level of sophistication, and weaponized malware can be identified as having motive and intent. So the malware itself was designed to do one thing. So the person who's getting into this web server may want to use the malware to get data. It may be the idea so they can turn things off later at a given time. So that's where we get into the whole idea of the cyber kill chain. That's when they want to get in, get access, and then leave that there for later. So you have someone who just might want to make your website look funny, right? We have someone who might want to steal your data. We have someone who may want to steal your data and steal someone else's data, right? And someone that wants to destroy your business. This is where we're getting into cyber espionage. It all depends on the size of your business. If you're like a little cupcake business and you only serve Bellingham, well, you're probably worried about the guy who wants to deface your website, right? Or the person who wants to turn your site into a watering hole. I promised to talk about a watering hole. So the idea of a watering hole is if someone wants to attack not you, but another organization or group of people, or even just infect massive users, they will attack a website and infect it with malware. That's just one example. So that when the person comes, they touch your website and then they can get infected. The idea being that if they want to get users at Boeing and they know a bunch of them order cupcakes every Wednesday, well, they might attack your website so that when Boeing orders that, they can get that information about that Boeing employee. On the other hand, they may want to cause havoc in Bellingham. So they'll pick a bunch of high-end used website by Bellingham users, and then turn those into watering holes, for example. So then they could get information on maybe people who have power over the power system or our traffic control system. So it's one of those, one or the other. Or they want to eventually get into Boeing and steal intellectual data. So they want to get information about a user from you and then get into Boeing. Right? Don't want to make you guys all paranoid because there are things you can do to protect yourself, right? So look at your what you have in your network, right? And then look at your web server as multiple pieces, not just one generic piece, right? So look at your web server and say you have a traditional LAMP stack, right? So you have Linux, secure your Linux. Move up to Apache, secure your Apache, right? Move up to your SQL. Make sure that's secure. Are you using Python? Are you using Perl? Are you using PHP? Go through your steps to secure that. Now look at your software you've installed. What can you do to limit their access to your web server and make them still function and usable for your end users? So you want to make an action plan because you don't want to have everything go wrong and then have to figure out what to do, right? Action plans will help reduce the number and the severity of your incidents because you already have a plan, which means you've already gone through and you've secured your stuff as well as you can, but things can still happen. You could have the unintentional insider, that guy who hits delete on something, or you could have the intentional insider. Oops, someone got let go, they're very disgruntled, and no one turned off his access. And for those of those who think who want to look into ways that could happen, you want to look up things like the Marucci water plant incident. It's where a contractor thought he could get a job with a power company. He was part of the group that helped come in and set it up. They didn't hire him. He was quite unhappy about this. He stole a laptop from the company he was working for and proceeded to attack that district's sewage supply system repeatedly over a series of months, and he spilled hundreds of thousands of raw sewage. So it's good to have a plan before that kind of thing happens, right? So you want to make an incident response team. So if you're like this poor person who they're like, by the way, you are responsible for our web server. Okay, but you need to know what the next step is to do, right? So you're going to work on securing your web server, but at the same time you're going to say, okay, but let's make an incident response team so that if something happens, we can respond in a organized manner. You don't want to just be running around like chickens with your head cut off, right? So generally that's your IT contact person. It's going to be a legal representative, so you're going to want a lawyer involved, right? Because what happens if user data is stolen? Do you know how to respond legally? Probably not, right? You'll need a public relations person. It might be someone in your HR, it's whoever your company's using for PR, and a member of your management because, you have to have stuff signed off by management, right? You want to create an incident response plan. So you're going to want to go through and evaluate the risks to your company. What is the worst case scenario? If your website goes down, are you an e-only business? If your website goes down, that's going to hurt, right? But better it goes down than you lose all your customer data, for example. So you'd rather go down in a way that protects you. But if your website goes down, what is the repercussions? You want to be able to plan for resiliency of your company, because what is the point of having a response plan if your response brings your company down, right? So you want to plan for how would you bring it back up if the worst case happens. If there was an earthquake, that's a risk to your company, right? To your web server. If your building caught on fire, that is a risk to your server. If somebody came and tripped over the power cord, if you control your own web server and somebody trips over your power cord, there's a problem, right? If you contract out, what happens if who you contract with for your web server loses power? Do they have a backup plan? Can they bring your website back on? Have you asked those questions? If not, do you have a backup plan? Do you have a backup server you can bring online? to bring your company back online. And the whole idea is you're going to want to be able to contain damage and minimize risk. If you have someone actively inside your server, the answer may not be run out and pull the plug. Do you guys know why?
Because you want to trace the call in progress, pretty much.
Right. Well, you might want to, if they're actively doing stuff, yeah?
There are the options of leaving the attacker on the box if you want to monitor what the attacker's doing.
Yeah.
Not
Right.
necessarily where they're from, but what they're doing.
Right.
And what stage they're at in part of the attack. If they're in like a very early stage of the attack, you might just mitigate it right there.
Right.
You really need to understand where the attacker's at.
Right. Because if you don't know how they got in, for example, if you didn't know how they got in, you just kick them out, they can just get back in. If you pull the plug, you could cause damage to your system, and they still know how to get in when you turn it back on, right? If you cut yourself off from the internet, you still have to figure out how did they get in. So you need to figure out how they got in. You also need to preserve evidence if possible. But there may be a situation in which it's not possible. So to talk about another somewhat current event, we'll talk about the Sony hack, right? When they got attacked, while it was optimal to try to keep servers online, they have a bunch of remote workers, right? And they figured out that the signature for the malware that was running on those systems, the issue is once it started exfiltrating data, when it was done, it executed a kill command. So it would delete the hard drive. Well, it's not optimal to leave it online if it's going to delete your hard drive, right? So then they contacted their employees ASAP and were like, hey, you need to turn that stuff off. And so they started shutting down everything as quickly as possible because they needed to preserve that data. So if killing it would hurt your data, you don't want to just kill it, right? But if killing it would protect your data, then you need to kill your servers. It just depends on your situation. That's where it's evaluating your needs and what is going on at the time. You may have to consult legal. You may have to consult your management, get things in writing. If you've been begging to upgrade your server, like, okay, we need to upgrade our operating system because it's out of date and there are known vulnerabilities, and your management says no, get it in writing. Because what's going to happen if your web server gets compromised? You'll get blamed, right? But you have the power to protect your system. You can go through it and evaluate what's going on. What do you have right now on your web server? What systems do you have to protect it? Do you already have a response plan? Do you regularly reevaluate your response plan? So it's just like everything else. Nothing is set and forget it, right? You all remember the old Ronco set and forget it dinners? So your security's really old. It's like set and forget your slow cooker dinner. Security's not like that, right? It needs to always be evaluated. So once you make your response plan, you don't want to be using a response plan that's 5 years old. It may not work for you today. So you need to reevaluate it regularly. So your company, your IT group, need to get together and evaluate how often does that need to, how volatile is your business? So how much do you need to revisit that, to update that? All right, do you guys have questions? I talked really fast today.
Say you're protecting against like an APT, like for the Sony hack, right? Would using host-based IDS, would that be optimal in that situation? Is that should we include that as part of a regular deployment?
Well, here's the thing: is when you're looking at your web server or your whole network. So anything that connects to that web server, you're gonna want to make sure that you have the security as good as you can control on it, right? So it would be good to have host-based IDS, both on whatever laptops or desktops you connect to that, but on your web server itself, right? A lot of times you'll have an external one also to protect it. So if you have a massive denial of service attack, that you have a way to protect against that. There are actually new robust ones that will notify you when it detects the denial of service has begun, and then it can actually evaluate the responses and shut that down, ignore those areas. If you guys want good resource for looking at your own web server and checking it for its vulnerabilities, OWASP. So do go to their website. I heartily encourage it. OWASP is all about, they have the OWASP top, anybody seen the OWASP top 10? Yeah, see, some people have, right? Those are nice, right? So, what, and you had a question?
Yeah, for a lot of smaller, I'm not sure if this is an appropriate question or not, but for a lot of smaller startup companies, they're starting to now do things on the cloud with like Heroku or AWS. What subset of your advice can be applied to that?
Okay, so when you are doing things like in the cloud, so nice see ephemeral, it's not really ephemeral because if you go and ask them, right? So if you are contracting with someone who's hosting your stuff in the cloud, or you're using any of that kind of stuff, I'm just starting to use Amazon's, so I can poke around with it and bring that kind of information when I come to talk next time. But my big recommendation is if you are doing any sort of remote hosting, shared hosting, in the cloud hosting, make sure that you're aware of how they handle security. How do they respond to breaches? How do they respond to denial of service attack? Especially if you're using cloud computing, because you want to be sure that they have taken into account things that can happen, such as someone else on the same server as you renting a computer and attacking other people on the shared server. I've been to talks with some of the cloud hosters who early in their cloud thing did not anticipate users using those clouds in malicious ways and now protect against that kind of thing. But if you're using not one of the big folks, you might want to check and ask what protections do they have to protect a computer or a server from other servers on that same shared hosting. Because when you're using, when you're like renting computer time from Amazon and Microsoft and all that, you're on a shared, like you're a bunch of VMs in one big server. Have they protected, now I know Microsoft and Amazon do now, but you still want to ask how they do it, right? Make sure you're familiar with what they do to protect one of those servers from another in the same virtualized setting. And ask them how they virtualize. How do they update it, right? Is there any way you can know what version they're on? Because if they're not updating, if they're like, oh yeah, sure, yeah, we update, but they're using like an older version, and it itself might have vulnerabilities, so that where your virtualized server is hosted has been compromised.
I think one thing to add on to that too, it's really important with these external hosting providers. They give you the sandbox and the playground to build your application. And so even more, that's very important, but I think one other thing that might get neglected a little bit is relying on security from that hosting provider.
Yeah.
But they give you that environment. You need to actually harden it. You need to restrict your firewall groups. You need to secure your web application. There's a whole laundry list of things. So first thing I would do, in my opinion, is work on hardening your services that you're exposed to the world.
Right.
And that's how you can do like a good mitigation step towards these low-level pinging attackers.
Right. So even if you are, it depends on how much services you are using, right? So even if you are someone who, say, if you're here and you're just like, well, how do I secure my WordPress? Well, you don't control a lot of stuff, right? You just have your little WordPress. Look at what you have control of and harden that to the best of your ability, right? And then you'll still want to find out any more security stuff beyond that.
Because the hosting provider doesn't care
Yeah.
what you do with it. They're like, here's your playground, go have fun. So, but if you're not hardening it, taking care of security on that, then you're going to get compromised, regardless of how the hypervisors manage, whether they have sandboxing in place or stuff to prevent escaping of VMs and stuff. So that's a pretty first thing. I have another question.
Yes.
I'm curious, why did you classify website defacement as ADT or associated ADT?
No. I was one potential threatening source. A threat to the website can be someone who just wants to deface your website, can be corporate espionage, can be APT.
Oh.
I go a little more in depth in APT because not everybody is familiar with APTs. I mean, we're all familiar with that concept of Joe Schmo wants to deface your website, right? So I go a little deeper in APT because when I start talking about APTs, people sometimes look at me blankly like, what are you talking about? So I like to talk a little bit deeper on that to touch on things that I think not everybody in the room might already be familiar with, especially since I pitched this to be an intermediate level, so I figure the advanced folks already are pretty familiar with APT as a concept. But intermediate and beginner folks who might be in here just to get that extra big bite, might need to know how to lecture information APT. So when you're looking at threats to your website, you want to evaluate all the different sources. You can have physical, whether it's your potential insider attack, if you have if you have intellectual data you need to protect, so corporate espionage, you want to protect it against APTs. When you're looking at evaluating intentional insiders, you can use the mice to help you remember motivations for why your intentional insiders might want to attack your website or attack your business, which is money, or they'll gain money out of it, or they're doing it for ideological reasons. So suddenly they decided your company is evil and doing bad things. Maybe they've decided that, right? You've wronged me. Maybe they're being blackmailed, so that is, of course, why did I blank on what C is then?
Coercion?
Coercion, yes. And then, so that's their being blackmailed, and then E is ego, they're doing it to feel important. And it can be a combination thereof, but that's one way to remember it, is your moles or your mice, right? But there's a lot of different potential. Don't let it get you intimidated that there are so many different things that could be a threat to your website. The whole idea is that if you secure it to the best of your abilities, right? And the idea is that don't necessarily think like an attacker, think like an insider. If somebody already knew all the stuff about your website, how might they still get in? If you can protect against yourself, then, although remember, you're only one way of thinking it, so that's the advantage of having someone else in your IT team to bounce things off of, to have it come from another perspective. Can they think of a different way to get into your website? Even if you're protected against SQL attacks, are you protected against cross-site scripting? Are you protected against, the myriad of ways that people attack your web applications? Yeah?
You mentioned it, but I kind of want to stress on it if I can. Documentation is very key. I had a friend of mine who worked for a hospital. Their site got compromised. He was pulled into a room with a lawyer, police officer, and everything else. And because he had documentation about when he made requests,
right,
and everything else, he saved himself from A, getting fired, B, legal implications. So you want to document everything you do to a system as well, because then you can say, I did this at this time. I have this track record.
Right.
That really helps you, one, if a breach should happen, two, secure your career and protect your reputation.
Right. So documentation is, like you said, super important, right? If something happened to your system, but the thing is that's where you have your change logs, you have all your different so that, yes, it protects you. It's a big thing. It also protects, if you came in to, say, go work on you were hired to replace the former IT guy who left, and they had no documentation, how daunting would that be? I would be convinced that there was something really wrong if I came into a company and they had no documentation. So where I work now, we have what's called the potato book. The potato book is if somebody got hit, if whoever was in charge of that server got hit by a potato truck, that there's a book that has everything in it. All the changes, everything's been done to secure it, all the information for that kind of stuff. The thing is you also want to make sure you have a disaster recovery plan, business continuity plan, right? And so therefore you're protecting your business resiliency. So you want to look at where your business needs meet with your security needs and design everything appropriately, right? But do make sure you document everything. That's super important. Oh my gosh. Yeah, you don't want to not document every little thing you do. It can sound tedious, but if you will have a change to the system, you need to document it just because it makes your life easier and it helps make things more secure. Anything else?
Well, this is almost frivolous, but the people, the team at Microsoft Windows Live about 10 years ago published a paper on disaster mitigation. And one of the first things they did is created a set of boilerplate PR releases for when there is downtime at 2 in the morning and you fix it 15 minutes later. Here's the boilerplate, just put in the time and you can release it to the
Right.
press.
So there's a lot of information out there for you guys to get access to if you need it to. So what I was going to ask is if there's any system administrators in the room, if you guys could give other people in the room what your one piece of advice would be to other people who might be new or aspiring system administrators.
So something that I like to do, and it goes on basically monitoring the attacker's movements, is a lot of the attackers, they like to look for low-hanging fruit before they go for the big stuff. So what I like to do is I like to set up traps or honeypots, which is basically fake data that looks valuable to an attacker, and if I see them going after it, I can monitor that fully and then, oh, your server's been breached, so take down his IP address and his information and prevent him from getting further into your system to the real sensitive information.
I think one important thing that I see, I work in information security. One of the biggest things that I see is I see a lot of developers that you don't even need to be security focused for this, but a lot of people are focusing their time on what they're building to just hurry up and rush and deploy it and you just get it out there. And a lot of times you're going to have Swiss cheese full of vulnerabilities, misconfigurations that just lead to simple compromises by not even sophisticated people. This is like automated scanners that are scanning, finding a vulnerability, exploiting it. Now they're using your service to pivot and attack other systems. So I think one of the biggest things I would recommend is like take your time, do the documentation, go nice and slow, have a peer review, do a security vulnerability assessment. I mean, there's no rush to deploying a product. Take your time.
And my recommendation to build on that would be I was building an application and it was being pushed, put it out. So I included in my documentation where I knew, because I knew I wanted more time. And I included documentation on where the vulnerabilities were. I was like, if something was done here, this would be compromised. If something was done here, this would be compromised. And I got more time. Just by telling them, look, here is the big problem. So make sure, if you're building something, try to make it as securely coded as possible.
Do it the right way the first time.
Yeah, I prefer doing it the right way the first time because, you don't want it to bite you on the rear later. Oh, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, just get baselines, and of course, I already iterated on documentation.
Yes, baselines are really important. That's what I was talking about. Make sure you have a baseline of the performance of your network. Actually, there's some new malware detection software being developed in California, and it is actually based on. It can actually, so far, it's done pretty well finding new. Like they'll make malware on purpose to test it, and so far it's been really good at finding new malware based on baseline. But it has to find a good baseline first.
Keeping third-party libraries and frameworks up to date.
Yeah, that's really important.
This may not be exactly related to individual server compromise, but would you have any insights to motivations for the end of like a DDoS attack on a mass scale? I see these sometimes.
For the what?
Okay, so like I work for a hosting company, so I'll sometimes see DDoS attacks come in, and I'm just wondering like why do they do this? What's the motivation for doing this? Other than maybe it's like some version of decasing.
Right. Well, in a way it can be, but it all depends on who is behind it. And so it could be that someone is doing the DDoS because especially if it's a shared hosting environment, they might be intending to attack one host. But they're just taking out the entire server because they're just trying to get to one little guy that's on that shared hosting. If it's on a particular, like a dedicated, like somebody paid for their own space, and that one's being attacked, probably somebody has a problem with that, or they're testing to see. A good example would be some DDoS attacks are meant to see if the site will fail open, because then they can deface it afterwards. Sometimes it comes at the end of, ironically, that was one of the techniques used in one of the Syrian electronic army attacks. Was they DDoS first and then they deface. Now they have different techniques they use, but sometimes it's for the lulz.
Lizard squad.
So I would look and see where it might come from.
I think also like a big attacker motivation for DDoSes that I've seen are through like extortion methods.
Yep.
Like there's a group DDoS for or Bitcoin for DDoS or DDoS for Bitcoin. They recently got taken down, but the name's pretty self-explanatory. They send you a ransom email saying we're going to insert your host offline unless you pay Y amount of Bitcoin, and then they follow or don't follow the attack based on what you do. So we see a lot of that too.
And then it's just trying to get that one snowball from tiny bathroom window. You know, that one codex that can go in. And
Right.
they're just, because all your systems focus on one thing, your IT's focus on one thing, but when you get that one piece of code compromised, or one system compromised, then there's one.
All right, guys. So that is it. We pretty much run just about to the end. So thank you. You can come get your laptop back. Thank you.